If you ask me when the war truly ended, the history books will tell you it was on the deck of the Missouri, or perhaps when that mushroom cloud rose over Hiroshima. But for those of us who served in Task Force 58, the outcome of the war was decided long before that, on a morning in June 1944. Close my eyes now and I can still smell it, that distinct blend of 100-octane aviation fuel, the sun-baked non-skid coating on the flight deck, and the salty tang of the Pacific wind. That smell represented power, absolute, overwhelming industrial power. It was early June 1944 at Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands. I was standing on the flight deck of the Blue Ghost, my mothership, the Essex-Class carrier USS Lexington CV-16. If you lived through the desperation of 1942, you'd understand just how surreal the scene before me was. 2 years prior, our carrier fleet had been all but wiped out. The old Lexington CV-2 was lost in the Coral Sea. The Hornet CV-8 broken at Santa Cruz. The Yorktown CV-5 sleeping forever beneath the waves of Midway. Back then, we were trying to fill the bottomless pit of the Pacific with nothing but blood and scrap iron. But now, standing by the bridge of CV-16, I looked out, and the entire Majuro Atoll was dyed navy blue. It wasn't just a fleet, it was a moving archipelago of steel. Off my port side lay the lead ship of her class, the USS Essex CV-9, cutting the waves like a towering mountain. Beyond her were the newly built Hornet CV-12 and Yorktown CV-10, names inherited from martyrs, but bodies built from the new Essex blueprint. Then there was the Bunker Hill CV-17, the Wasp CV-18. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher hadn't just assembled a fleet. He had assembled a nation's rage and an industrial miracle. We had 15 aircraft carriers, including 7 heavy Essex-Class and 8 light Independence-class carriers. It was a force without precedent. The air power of this single task force exceeded the combined air forces of any other nation on Earth at the time. Where were we going? Everyone knew, though no one said it aloud. We were going to the Marianas. We were going to kick down the front door of the Japanese Empire's absolute defense sphere. And the Japanese, their last remaining combined fleet, were waiting for us. I was a fighter pilot. Usually, we only cared about what happened inside the cockpit. But living on an Essex-class carrier, you couldn't help but be awed by the engineering aesthetic of the ship itself. This class of carrier was a true revolutionary. Some green ensigns complained that the corridors were a maze, but I told them, this ship is a perfect machine built for war. Compared to the pre-war Yorktown class, the Essex was longer, wider, and heavier. But it wasn't just about size. It was a quantum leap in survivability and offensive efficiency. I remember a conversation in the wardroom before we sailed. Our chief engineer slapped the table and said, "This ship is unsinkable." It was bragging, sure. It was war, after all, but he had reason to be confident. The Essex design had absorbed every painful lesson from the early war. Her watertight compartments were scientifically arrayed, and the aviation fuel system, the Achilles heel that had caused so many carriers to detonate, had been completely redesigned with better protection and CO2 purging systems. But for us pilots, only 2 things mattered: deck cycle efficiency and anti-aircraft fire. The Essex flight deck was less than 900 feet long, yet in that limited space, we could operate over 90, sometimes 100 aircraft. This was made possible by a revolutionary design feature, the deck edge elevator. It meant aircraft movement didn't clog the center of the deck. We could launch strike waves faster than the Japanese and recover them faster too. In naval warfare, speed is life. As for air defense, God above. If you stood on the island superstructure and looked down, the ship looked like a hedgehog of gun barrels. Before this, carriers relied on us fighters for cover. Anything that slipped through was left to luck. But now, every Essex was armed with radar-guided 5-inch dual-purpose guns, plus countless 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons. Later, in the Philippine Sea, I saw the curtain of lead those guns could put up. It was like they were weaving a solid steel net in the sky. This was the platform we rode into the decisive battle. The Japanese Navy was still placing its faith in Yamato spirit and Bushido. We brought Detroit assembly lines and Pittsburgh steel. It was asymmetric warfare. The Japanese just hadn't realized yet that they were no longer facing the ragged U.S. Navy of 1942. If the Essex-Class was our mobile fortress, the F6F Hellcat was the spear in our hand. I was the commander of Fighter Squadron 16, VF-16. On the side of my plane was painted a grinning cat. Before 1943, we flew the F4F Wildcat against the Japanese Zero, and that was a painful experience. The Zero was light, turned on a dime, and had incredible range. In a low-speed dogfight, any American pilot who tried to turn with a Zero usually ended up as a burning wreck. But Grumman gave us the F6F. Even sitting on the deck, you could feel the brute force of the machine. It wasn't elegant. It was even a bit ugly, like a beer keg stuffed with mussels. But it had a powerful heart. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, pumping out 2,000 horsepower. By comparison, the Zero's 1,100 horsepower engine was a toy. When lecturing the rookies in the Lexington's hangar, I always said, "Don't try to ballet dance with a Zero. That's suicide. Use your speed, use your altitude, use your armor. You are driving a tank. They are flying a kite." The Hellcat changed everything. It was faster than the Zero, and its dive speed was crushing. The cockpit had heavy armor plating, and the self-sealing fuel tanks wouldn't catch fire even if turned into Swiss cheese. And those 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns? A 2-second burst was enough to tear any Japanese plane into confetti. More importantly, it was forgiving. It drove like a reliable farm truck. It forgave your rough handling, took you into hell, and brought you home safe. That's why we called it the Ace Maker. In the coming battle, it was this technical superiority that allowed us to slaughter Japanese pilots who were still religiously clinging to maneuverability. This wasn't just a war of machines, but of men. And in this dimension, the gap was even more terrifying. Before sailing for the Marianas, I flipped through the pilot roster. My boys averaged 21 years old, kids from Kansas wheat farms, Brooklyn streets, or California colleges. But look at their records. Before stepping onto a carrier deck, every one of them had flown at least 350 to 400 hours at training bases back in the States. Add in fleet adaptability training, and their average flight time exceeded 500 hours. The U.S. Navy training system was a precision assembly line. We practiced carrier landings on the Great Lakes and dogfighting tactics in Florida. We didn't lack fuel, we didn't lack planes, and we didn't lack bullets. Every pilot sent to the Pacific was an elite product of a rigorous selection process. We learned the thatch weave, learned to cover each other by radio, learned to trust our wingmen. And our opponents? The intelligence officer in the briefing room told us that the backbone of Japanese naval aviation had been broken at Midway and the Solomons. The elite veterans who attacked Pearl Harbor were mostly at the bottom of the sea. The current Japanese pilots were rush jobs fresh out of flight school. Word was, the batch facing us this June averaged only 100 to 275 flight hours, with a critical lack of combat practice. Because Japan was starving for fuel, their training was strictly rationed. Even more fatal was their brutal hierarchy. Veterans hoarded their secrets rather than teaching rookies. Our veterans were rotated home to become instructors, passing the secrets of survival down generation by generation. It was destined to be an unfair fight. But in war, fairness is for the dead. Our job was to exploit that unfairness and crush them completely. June 6, 1944 was a memorable day. On the other side of the globe, our Army brothers were bleeding on the beaches of Normandy. But in the Pacific, Task Force 58, that Leviathan commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, was slicing through the waves, heading west. Our target, the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. In Lexington's war room, Admiral Mitcher, that withered, quiet old man who loved to sit backward in his bridge chair watching flight ops while wearing a baseball cap, gathered us. His voice was soft, but it carried a chill. Gentlemen, the Japanese have always wanted a decisive battle, Kantai Kessen. This time, we are delivering it to their doorstep. We knew Jisaburo Ozawa was coming with his mobile fleet. We didn't know his exact location, but the murderous intent leaking through the radio silence was palpable. They had the Taiho, their newest armored carrier, and the veterans of Pearl Harbor, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. But that didn't scare us. I walked out onto the flight deck and looked around. 900 aircraft, 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 69 destroyers. The formation occupied dozens of square miles of ocean. It was the most powerful naval strike force in human history. On June 11th, we began our preliminary airstrikes on the Marianas. This was the overture. That day, I led 4 Hellcats on combat air patrol, SEAP. As we flew over Saipan, the anti-aircraft fire from the ground was sporadic. The Japanese fortifications weren't finished, and their resistance in the air was feeble. This is their so-called absolute defense sphere? My wingman Jimmy scoffed over the radio. Don't get cocky, Jimmy, I replied. The big fish are still out there. Ozawa hasn't shown his hand yet. Indeed, a real storm was brewing. Intelligence indicated the Japanese first mobile fleet had sortied from Tawi-Tawi, crossing the Philippine Sea, heading straight for us. Their plan was to use the long range of their aircraft, Zeros, and the new D-4Y Judy bombers outranged us, to strike from beyond our reach, shuttle bombing. They planned to launch, hit us, land on the airfields of Guam and Rota to refuel and rearm, and then hit us again on the way back. On paper, it was a perfect plan. But they overlooked 2 things. First, our radar technology had peaked that month. Our CIC, Combat Information Center, was no longer just a room. It was the brain of the fleet. Second, and most importantly, the men sitting in those Japanese cockpits were no longer the samurai of old, but children who could barely hold a formation, and waiting for them was a pack of Hellcat pilots, armed to the teeth and hungry for revenge. On June 15th, U.S. forces landed on Saipan. It was a dagger thrust into the heart of the Japanese Empire. Tokyo went mad. They had to counterattack. If the Marianas fell, B-29 bombers could strike the Japanese homeland directly. For the Japanese Navy, this was the last chance. Win here or perish. On June 18th, Task Force 58 gathered west of Saipan. Admiral Raymond Spruance, our overall commander, was a cautious man. He ordered us to cover the landing beaches and not to chase west blindly, fearing a flank attack. This annoyed Mitcher and frustrated us pilots. We wanted to rush out, grab the Japanese carriers by the throat, and smash them. We're like bulldogs chained to a post, I wrote in my diary. That night, the atmosphere in Lexington's ready room was heavy with excitement. Mechanics worked through the night checking every engine. Ordnancemen greased gun belts and loaded bombs. I went up to the deck at midnight. The sea was pitch black, under strict blackout conditions, but I could feel the presence of dozens of massive ships lurking in the dark, tens of thousands of sailors and pilots, sleepless like me. I knew that tomorrow, June 19th, 1944, would be a long day. I glanced up at the stars. The Southern Cross was twinkling. Somewhere in that deep darkness, I knew Ozawa had already launched his scout planes. In this silent night, hunter and prey were calibrating their weapons for the last time, and the Essex-Class carriers, these steel beasts of the sea, were vibrating gently as if thirsting for blood. Tomorrow, the Pacific would witness a slaughter like no other. We were ready. The morning of June 19th, 1944, the air was thick with the low pressure of an approaching storm. We were up at 0400. As a squadron leader, my first stop wasn't the cockpit, but the CIC, Combat Information Center. If you want to understand why we won the Marianas, don't just look at the Hellcats. Look at the officers staring at green glowing screens in dark rooms. Deep inside Lexington's island, the air conditioning was blasting, but it couldn't cool the sweat on the backs of the radar operators. This isn't Midway anymore, Tom. The fighter director officer, FDO, Lieutenant Johnson, handed me a cup of bitter coffee and pointed to the massive plotting board. 2 years ago, we relied on pilot eyeballs. Now, if an albatross sneezes 150 miles away, my SK radar sees it. This was another revolution brought by the Essex-Class. We didn't just have better ships and planes, we had the all-seeing eye. Every carrier linked by radio, coordinated by a central brain. We could see the enemy an hour before they saw us. At 0530, Japanese land-based planes from Guam tried to harass us. Scattered Zeros and old bombers. Our fighters swatted them into the sea like flies before they even touched the inner perimeter. But that was just the appetizer. Around 1,000 hours, the real alarm sounded. I remember that moment. The clear scan lines on the radar screen suddenly erupted into a dense smear of bright blips, like someone had thrown a handful of glowing sand onto the display. Bogies! Bearing 260, range 150 miles, Angels High, quantity. My God, quantity is many. Lieutenant Johnson's voice pitched up, but he didn't panic. He grabbed the mic. Alert! This is a large raid. This is not a drill. On the bridge, Admiral Mitcher gave the famous order. Hey Rube, a circus distress call meaning everyone out for a fight. It meant every airborne fighter returned to cover the fleet, and every fighter on deck launched immediately. The Essex-Class deck efficiency was vindicated in that moment. On Lexington, the bullhorn roared. Pilots, man your planes. My boys and I sprinted from the ready room like track athletes. My Hellcat, side number 16, was already warmed up by the crew. The R2800 engine grumbled at idle, a sound of reassuring power. I climbed in, buckled up, and watched the folded wings of the plane ahead of me lock into place. Green flag, go. We didn't use catapults. We used the deck wind to sprint into the air. One after another, Lexington spit out dozens of murderous Hellcats in minutes. Essex, Hornet, Bunker Hill, all 15 carriers were doing the same. We circled and rallied above the fleet like a swarm of angry hornets. The FDO's voice came over the headset, terrifyingly calm. Blue Leader, this is base. Vector 275, distance 60 miles, Angels 20. That's Raid 1, intercept. This wasn't a dogfight. It was a guided execution. We didn't need to hunt for the enemy. CIC guided us like radio-controlled toys directly into the path of the Japanese. We met the first wave at about 24,000 feet. It was a mixed formation of about 60 to 70 planes. It was my first time seeing the last of the Japanese Navy's fortune. Zeros, Jill torpedo bombers, and Judy dive bombers. Before the war, we heard Japanese pilots had eagle eyes, but this time, they didn't seem to realize we existed until we dove on them like thunderbolts from above. Tally-ho! All units, attack! I shouted into the radio. My Hellcat screamed as it sliced into the Japanese formation. My first target was a 0 on the flank. The poor guy was obviously a rookie. Seeing me dive, he did something incredibly stupid. He pulled his nose up, trying to climb and meet me head-on. If it were 1942 and that was Saburo Sakai in the cockpit, he would have used the 0's turn radius to shake me. But this kid, he just exposed his fragile aluminum belly to my guns. I didn't need complex aiming. The 6.50 cals converged at 300 yards. I squeezed the trigger. Tracers lashed his wing root like whips of fire. In 2 seconds, the 0 disintegrated in mid-air, blooming into an orange fireball. Splash 1! Confirmed splash! The battle exploded instantly, turning into a one-sided chase. The F6F Hellcat showed its true genius. We were faster, heavier, and meaner. We used altitude to boom and zoom, hit them, pull up, never get tangled. And the Japanese? God, their movements were so stiff it was pitiful. They stayed in tight bomber formation, not scattering to evade, like turkeys waiting for the axe. Check your 6, left side, my wingman Jimmy yelled. A Japanese Jill tried to slip low to go after the battleships. Jimmy nosed over, but he dove too steep. I saw the Jill's rear gunner firing desperately. Bullets pinged off Jimmy's Hellcat. If that had been an old Wildcat or a Japanese plane, Jimmy might have been done. But the F6F is a flying tank. Jimmy was unscathed. He corrected his angle and shredded the Jill with a precise long burst. This is ridiculous, I thought. This isn't an air battle. It's like shooting towed targets back at the Great Lakes. We learned later that this was the moment Alex Vratsiu, the legendary ace from Lexington, coined the phrase. Upon landing, looking at the grinning deck crew, he said, "It was just like an old-fashioned turkey shoot." And so, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was born. While I was enjoying the hunt at 20,000 feet, I must pause my memoir to salute another group. Because victory that day wasn't just decided by us with wings, but by the silent men in the deep. I heard this part of the story later, in a Pearl Harbor officers' club, from a submarine skipper. But it belongs to this battle, to this glorious June 19th. While we were slaughtering Ozawa's air wings, Ozawa's flagship, the unsinkable armored carrier Taiho, was living a nightmare. Taiho was the pride of the Imperial Navy, her deck plated with heavy armor, theoretically proof against 500-pound bombs. Ozawa made her his flagship because he thought she was invincible. He didn't count on the USS Albacore SS-218. That morning, as we prepared for the air raids, Albacore spotted Ozawa's fleet underwater. The old sub took a shot, firing 6 torpedoes at Taiho. Japanese luck hadn't quite run out yet. A Japanese pilot who had just taken off, Sakio Komatsu, saw the torpedo wake. To protect his mother ship, the heroic Japanese pilot dove his plane directly into one of the torpedoes, detonating it. Awe-inspiring sacrifice. But it wasn't enough. Another torpedo hit home. For a Leviathan like Taiho, one torpedo shouldn't have been fatal. It jammed the forward elevator and caused some flooding. Ozawa didn't even slow down, but he made a fatal error. The Japanese Navy had suicidal courage, but they lacked scientific damage control. To clear the smell of leaking fuel, inexperienced damage control teams opened the ship's ventilation system. It was suicide. Highly volatile avgas fumes spread to every corner of the ship. Taiho became a floating aerosol bomb, waiting for a spark. That afternoon, while we were shredding their planes, a massive explosion echoed from the direction of the Japanese fleet. Taiho suffered a catastrophic detonation. The armored savior of Japan blew herself into scrap metal because of her own crew's incompetence and one submarine strike. Another veteran, the Shokaku, a survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack, had worse luck. Around noon, she was stalked by the USS Kavala, SS-244. Kavala was a rookie boat, but her skipper was a cold-blooded killer. 4 torpedoes slammed into Shokaku. This time, there was no miracle, no slow death. The carrier that had tormented us at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz capsized rapidly in the June afternoon, dragging hundreds of crew and the outdated Imperial Dream to the bottom of the Pacific. Listening to the chaos on the Japanese radio frequencies, we pilots guessed something was up. "Looks like someone saved us some work," my wingman cracked. Yes, June 19th, 1944 was the death day of Japanese naval aviation. But beneath the waves, our submarine force rang the funeral bell for their carrier fleet, back to the air. While we intercepted the vast majority, a few leakers broke through our line toward the task force. If you thought we were invincible in the air, you should have seen the surface. I was returning to refuel, looking down from high altitude. Task Force 58 was arranged in a massive circular anti-aircraft formation. Battleships and cruisers on the rim, carriers at the core. When a dozen Japanese bombers tried to penetrate, a black wall rose from the sea. It was the VT fuse, proximity fuse, at work. Another secret weapon. Old flak shells needed a direct hit or a timed fuse setting. Inefficient. But the VT fuse had a micro radar inside. If it sensed metal, a plane, nearby, it detonated automatically. I saw a Judy dive on the bunker hill. Before it reached the release point, a 5-inch shell burst 20 yards away. No direct hit, but the shrapnel instantly shredded the plane. It didn't even catch fire. It just turned into a cloud of loose parts. This was absolute defense. That day, the task force's AA fire downed about 19 planes. No American carrier was heavily damaged. The battleship USS South Dakota took a bomb, a flesh wound. She kept spitting fire. This was the crushing weight of industrial might. The Japanese were throwing flesh and blood against a steel wall made of radar, analog computers, and infinite ammunition. All day, the Japanese launched 4 massive raids. The script was identical every time. Radar sees them 100 miles out. FDO vectors, Hellcats to altitude. We dive, shoot, watch them burn. The leakers get pulverized by the fleet's guns. By afternoon, my arm ached from wrestling the stick, and I'd sweated through my flight suit 3 times. But I had never felt such exhilaration. On the 3rd sortie, I downed 2 Val dive bombers trying to hit Hornet. The feeling was strange. The initial tension was gone, replaced by a mechanical coldness. I checked the clock, 1400. Pilots were joking on the radio. "Hey, leave some for me, don't kill 'em all." You can't kill 'em all, they keep sending more to die. But by the end of the 4th wave, the sky finally went quiet. The sea was littered with burning wreckage and oil slicks, the lifeblood of Japanese naval aviation. That night, tallying the score in Lexington's ready room, the intelligence officer's hands were shaking. "Gentlemen," his voice rasped, "preliminary counts say we splashed over 300 enemy aircraft today." Silence for 1 second. Then the room erupted. Even the stoic Admiral Mitcher cracked a smile. We didn't know the exact number then. Historians later counted. On June 19th, the Japanese lost 315 carrier planes. And us? We lost less than 30, 10-1, a number unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. A death sentence. Ozawa's mobile force, the power he had hoarded for a year, was wiped out in 8 hours. The Japanese naval aviation that once swept the Pacific effectively ceased to exist that June day. But I knew it wasn't over. We broke their back, but their ships, those empty carriers, were running. "We have to chase them," I wrote in my diary. "Tomorrow, we harvest the rest of the crop." Admiral Spruance finally unleashed the chain. Task Force 58 turned its bow west, chasing the setting sun. The real pursuit was just beginning. The morning of June 20th, 1944. The ocean was calm, but it was a suffocating calm. Yesterday's turkey shoot felt like ancient history. Task Force 58 was now a hungry beast, prowling westward, trying to catch Ozawa's fleeing ships. In the ready rooms, we were restless. We knew that while we killed their birds yesterday, the nests, the carriers, were still out there. If they escaped to Japan, they'd be back in months with new planes. Spruance is too cautious. That was the consensus in the pilot's lounge. We felt we should have charged yesterday. But naval warfare isn't a bar fight. Spruance had to think about not losing, not just winning. If we had rushed west and a Japanese surface fleet had flanked us to hit the landing beaches, it would have been a disaster. But now, with the game won, we just needed to nail the coffin shut. Time ticked by. Noon passed. 1300 passed. Nothing. Wave after wave of scout planes returned with nothing but pictures of empty ocean. The Pacific is too big, and the Japanese were under strict radio silence. Just as we thought the day was awash, at 1540, the ship's squawk box crackled. The voice was static-laced but hit us like a shot of adrenaline. Contact. Bearing 275, range 275 miles. A Lexington scout had found the Japanese fleet refueling at the very edge of our reach. 275 miles. Even without a chart, I knew what that number meant. For a plane loaded with bombs, that was a desperate distance. Our Hellcats had good legs, but the TBF Avengers with torpedoes and the SB-2C Helldivers, we called them the Beast, lugging heavy bombs. A round trip was pushing the absolute limit of physics. Worse, it was 1600 hours. Even if we launched now, we'd arrive at sunset. We would be attacking in twilight and flying home in the dark. In 1944, night carrier landings were still a black art, extremely dangerous, usually reserved for specialized night squadrons. Now, we were asking hundreds of regular pilots to find a ship in the dark with empty tanks. It was a gamble. At 1610, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher made the call. In the briefing room, I heard the order. Launch attack, immediately. No complex tactics, no detailed flight plan. The order was simple. Catch them, sink them, and try to stay alive. Mitcher knew he'd lose men, but he knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. I looked at my wingman, Jimmy. He was pale, but his eyes were set. "Sir, I guess we lean the mixture out to the max, right?" He forced a smile. "Yeah, Jimmy," I patted his shoulder. "Nurse that gas like a miser. See you on the other side." Lexington turned into the wind. The deck was a hive of peak activity, a so-called alpha strike. I slammed the throttle. The R2800 roaring, green flag. My Hellcat clawed into the humid air. Behind me, Hornet, Bunker Hill, Yorktown. Every Essex-Class was vomiting warplanes. 216 aircraft formed the strike group. We formed up, but loosely, to save fuel. We flew west, chasing the falling sun. That flight was the most oppressive 2 hours of my life. The view was breathtaking. The sunset dyed the clouds blood red and purple gold, the sea a deep velvet blue. But no one cared about the view. Every set of eyes was glued to the fuel gauge. The needle moved slowly, inevitably, to the left. Radio silence was strict, but I could hear hundreds of hearts beating in sync. We were racing the sun. The sun was dying, and we had to find the Japanese before darkness swallowed the ocean. 2 hours felt like 2 centuries. Finally, around 1830, just as the last light was fading, we saw wakes on the water. It was a spectacular, chaotic mess. The Japanese fleet was scattered, like a flock of frightened sheep. Ozawa's last ships, Zuikaku, Junyo, Hiyo, Chiyoda, they were running northwest. "Attack! Attack! Freely!" The suppressed radio channels exploded. No coordination needed. Everyone knew what to do. This wasn't a synchronized strike. It was a wolf pack descending on prey. The Japanese reaction was fierce. Though they had lost almost everything yesterday, about 35 fighters rose to intercept, and the ships put up a wall of flak. In the twilight, the battle took on a surreal visual quality. You couldn't see the ships clearly, only the tongues of fire erupting from the sea. Tracers drew deadly neon lines in the dusk, like holiday fireworks, but every spark wanted you dead. I led my division into the zeros. This time, the Japanese pilots weren't the foolish rookies of yesterday. They knew this was the end, and they fought with vicious desperation. But I had no time for them. My job was to cover the bombers. "Jimmy, watch that big one." Below us, TBF Avengers from the Belo Wood were making a run on a massive carrier, the Hyo, a converted merchantman, slow but huge. Hyo turned hard left to evade, but by now the darkness masked the torpedo wakes. I saw the kill. A torpedo slammed into her starboard engine room. Moments later, a heavy bomb, dropped by who knows whom, smashed into her bridge area. A massive explosion lit up the dusk. Hyo lost power instantly, drifting like a dying whale. Fire consumed the flight deck in minutes. Hours later, she would take her crew to the bottom. Elsewhere, Zuikaku, the Pearl Harbor survivor, was under siege. She dodged the torpedoes with masterful handling, but bomb hits turned her into a floating inferno. The attack lasted only 20 minutes. The sun was gone. The sky turned deep purple, then black. All units, return to base. Repeat, return to base. The voice of reason pulled us back. We had hurt them, sunk a carrier, confirmed as Hyo, damaged others. But now we faced an enemy scarier than the Japanese, a night without fuel. The flight back was a nightmare. We turned east. It was pitch black now, no moon, few stars. My fuel gauge was hovering near the E. I leaned the mixture to the edge of stalling, dropped RPMs, trying to squeeze every drop. Heartbreaking calls began to fill the radio. Blue 3 calling, engine flaming out, ditching. Good luck, boys. Then static. The sound of a plane hitting water. It began, one after another. Some didn't make it halfway. We were flying beyond the limit. The SB-2C Helldivers had it worst. Those heavy beasts guzzled gas, and some were dragging unreleased bombs due to mechanical faults. I flew alone in the dark. The formation had shattered. Everyone was finding their own way to survive. I couldn't distinguish the sky from the sea. It was a deep-sea claustrophobia. If I went down here, in the middle of the Pacific, no one would ever find me. Around 2030, we should be near the fleet, but I looked down, nothing. To protect against submarines, Task Force 58 was under strict blackout. The fleet was sailing in total darkness. For us, with gallons left in the tank, it was despair. We knew they were there, but we were blind moths looking for a flame that wasn't there. My engine sputtered. Fuel starvation. Damn it! I slammed the dash. "Mitcher, where are you? Give us a sign." Just as I prepared to unbuckle for a water landing, a miracle happened. On Lexington's bridge, I heard later, there was a fierce argument. Regulations said, no lights in a combat zone. Iron law. Turn on the lights, and you tell every Japanese sub, "Here I am, come shoot me." But Mark Mitcher watched the radar blips, his 200 boys, disappearing one by one. He knew if he did nothing, he would lose the finest generation of pilots. It wasn't just losing planes, it was killing the future of the Navy. So the gaunt admiral turned to his chief of staff and gave the order that would go down in history: turn on the lights. In that instant, a divine event occurred on the ocean surface. From the air, the darkness below suddenly erupted into light. First, the searchlights. The Essex-Class giant vertical beams pierced the clouds. Then, destroyers fired star shells. Then, every ship, from battleships to frigates, flipped on running lights, recognition lights, even signal lamps. It looked like a Hollywood premiere or Times Square. In the pitch-black center of the Pacific, Task Force 58 lit up the entire ocean for its children. I almost cried. It wasn't just light. It was the way home. It told us, the fleet cares more about us than the damn rulebook. But it wasn't over. Landing was still a disaster. Usually, a carrier landing is surgical. You have a pattern, an LSO, landing signal officer. That night, it was a chaotic survival frenzy. Mitcher ordered, land on any deck. You didn't need to find your mom. You saw a flat deck, you put it down. The sky was a mess, hundreds of planes circling, fighting for the groove. Some planes ran dry in the pattern and cut in line. I saw a Hellcat try to land, forgetting flaps, coming in too hot. He jumped the barrier and crashed into the parked planes forward. But it saved him. The deck crew rushed in, pulled him out, and physically pushed the wrecked plane into the sea. Cruel necessity to clear the deck for the next guy. My low fuel light had been staring at me for eternity. I saw a carrier silhouette, looked like Bunker Hill, but I didn't care. I dropped the nose, gear down. My legs were shaking, but I had to hold it together. This is Filthy 16 coming in. I couldn't see the LSO, just the faint deck lights. I flew by instinct, speed, altitude, angle of attack, life or death in seconds. Slam. My tailhook caught the third wire. Inertia crushed me against the straps. The plane stopped. The engine sputtered once and died. I probably didn't have a cup of gas left. Climbing out, I saw bedlam. A helldiver from Hornet had just crash-landed nearby, wheels snapped. At the bow, a bulldozer was shoving a TBF overboard. A flight deck chief ran up, grabbed me, and handed me a cup of whiskey, strictly illegal, but to hell with it. "Welcome to the Bunker Hill, sir," he grinned, face covered in grease. "Thanks, Chief." I gasped, watching planes still falling from the sky under the searchlights. We lost about 80 aircraft that night, mostly to fuel starvation and crashes. But because of the fleet's courage, those lights, and the destroyers fishing men out all night, we saved almost all the pilots. Out of 200-plus aircrew, only 16 pilots and 33 crewmen were lost. Given the mission, it was a miracle. The next morning, I caught a destroyer ride back to Lexington. Breakfast in the wardroom was strange, victory mixed with grief. Yesterday's turkey shoot was a fun slaughter. Last night's mission in darkness was a trial of the soul, but the result was decisive. Intelligence confirmed Ozawa's mobile force was destroyed. Taiho, Shokaku, Hiyo sunk, Zuikaku and others crippled. Their air groups wiped out. Japanese naval aviation as a strategic force died on the night of June 20th, 1944. From then on, their carriers were just decoys or cargo ships. The Essex-Class and WWII pilots proved something that night. Victory isn't just about whose blade is sharper, but who cares more about the man holding the blade. When Mitcher turned on those lights, he won our undying loyalty. As for Japan, the door to the Marianas was kicked open. Next, we would face something not conventional, but madder and more desperate. I didn't know it then, but our victory here would push Japan into the abyss of the Kamikaze. That's a story for later. Now, we were going home to rest, because the next storm was gathering at Leyte Gulf. By October 1944, the wind in the Pacific had turned wilder. After the Marianas, we didn't rest long. When we returned to Ulithi Atoll, that massive lagoon filled with supply ships and floating dry docks, there was a subtle but massive change. Look at the harbor, and you'd see the same steel beasts. Lexington, Essex, New Jersey, same ships, paint barely dry. But the brain had changed. Admiral Spruance handed over command to plan the next phase. In his place came Admiral William Bull Halsey. So, the 5th Fleet became the 3rd Fleet. Task Force 58 became Task Force 38. Spruance was a cool accountant calculating risk and return. Halsey? He was a brawler who wanted to smash your face into the bar top. He swore after Pearl Harbor to make Japanese a language spoken only in hell. His aggressive style excited us pilots, but it also gave us a vague sense of unease. In Lexington's briefing room, the shift was palpable. "We aren't playing watchdog like in the Marianas," my new air group commander slapped the map with a pointer. "Admiral Halsey's orders are clear. If the main Japanese fleet appears, our primary task is destroy it. It was mid-October. Target, Leyte, Philippines. We were there to cash General MacArthur's I shall return check. Sailing out of Ulithi, I looked back at Murderer's Row, 5 Essex-Class carriers anchored side by side. We had absolute command of sea and sky, yet, in this absolute superiority, we were about to face the most chaotic, hair-raising week of the war. October 24th, the battle erupted. The Japanese launched Operation Shogo, a desperate gamble to pincer our landing fleet at Leyte from 3 directions. That morning, I flew a strike into the Philippine Sea. We found Takeo Kurita's main force, including the legendary super battleship Musashi. If you haven't seen the Musashi, you can't imagine it. It was a moving volcano. Even after taking a dozen torpedoes and bombs, she kept spitting fire. We finally put her under, but it felt like killing an elephant with toothpicks. Returning with our victory, a false sense of triumph filled the squadron. But approaching the fleet, a pillar of black smoke pierced the clouds, snapping us back to reality. It was the USS Princeton CVL-23, an Independence-class light carrier, smaller than our Essex, but our brother. Earlier, a lone Japanese Judy, just one, slipped out of the clouds. It dropped a 550-pound bomb, threading the needle through the flight deck. Luck stood with the Japanese that moment. The bomb exploded on the hangar deck, igniting fueled Avengers and torpedoes. Circling to land, I saw the grisly scene. The cruiser USS Birmingham was alongside, helping fight the fire. Her deck was packed with hundreds of damage control parties and sailors. Suddenly, Princeton's magazine detonated. Even at thousands of feet, I felt the shockwave. Princeton's stern was blown off. Massive steel plates fluttered like leaves, then slashed down like guillotines onto the crowded deck of the Birmingham. In a split second, Birmingham's deck became a slaughterhouse. Hundreds of men dead. I felt sick in my cockpit. It was a warning. We had 15 carriers, we had Hellcats, but one lucky bomb or one madman who didn't care about dying could deal a devastating blow. It foreshadowed that the Japanese were changing tactics. They stopped seeking a fair fight and started seeking mutual destruction. Evening, October 24th. While Princeton burned, a scout report arrived. Enemy carrier force spotted, bearing north, east of Cape Engano. It was Ozawa's northern force. 4 carriers, including Zuikaku, the one that got away at the Marianas. In the flag plot, Halsey made the decision that would be debated for half a century. He decided Kurita's battleship force in the Philippine Sea was battered and retreating. He decided the carriers were the threat. Naval tradition, carriers must fight carriers. We go north, Halsey ordered. All hands north. He took all of Task Force 38, all the Essex carriers, all the fast battleships. He left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. He left the door wide open. We didn't know it was a trap. Ozawa had barely any planes left. They were sacrificial lambs to lure us away from Leyte. But for us pilots, the order made our blood boil. Finally, I told my boys in the ready room, we are going to finish the last carrier that hit Pearl Harbor. This is the final chapter. Morning, October 25th, Cape Engano. This was Task Force 38 displaying peak firepower. We launched over 500 planes. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. Arriving over the target, the Japanese had almost no air cover. A dozen Zeros putting up a hopeless resistance. I led my fighters to sweep the sky, then watched the slaughter from above. Below lay Zuikaku and the light carriers Zuiho, Chitosa, Chiyoda. They circled frantically. Helldivers and Avengers from the Essex-Class rained down. This time, no mercy, no fuel worries. I watched Zuikaku, this legendary ship which mauled the old Lex at Coral Sea and sank the Hornet at Santa Cruz, the symbol of the Imperial Navy's glory and sin. Now, She was a beast being torn apart by wolves. At least 7 torpedoes and 9 heavy bombs hit her. She didn't detonate instantly like Taiho. She died slowly, stubbornly. But around 1100, the giant gave up. She listed to port, stern sinking. I flew low to confirm. I saw the massive rising sun flag still flying. Sailors gathered on the slanted deck, saluting toward the imperial palace. Then the vessel rolled over and sank. "That's the last one," I murmured. "Pearl Harbor is paid in full." A massive sense of relief washed over me. For my generation of aviators, sinking all 6 carriers from the Pearl Harbor attack, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu at Midway, Shokaku at Marianas, Zuikaku here, was a holy mission. Mission accomplished. But while we celebrated in the north, desperate radio waves arrived from the south. Around 1000, Lexington received panicked calls from Admiral Kincaid's 7th Fleet. "Taking fire from enemy main battle fleet off Samar. Request support. Urgent, urgent." Turns out, Kurita hadn't retreated. He turned around, slipped through the unguarded strait, and was now massacring our escort carrier group, Taffy 3, off Samar. It was a mismatch. Our brothers in slow jeep carriers were fighting the Yamato's 18-inch guns with 5-inch pop guns. Halsey didn't believe it at first. He thought we were fighting the main force. Until the message from Sinkpak Nimitz in Pearl Harbor arrived. "Where is RPT? Where is Task Force 34RR? The world wonders." The phrase slapped Halsey in the face. The world wonders part was padding that got mixed in, but the insult stung. Halsey was furious, but he had no choice. He turned our victorious carriers around and raced south. It was a painful sprint. We wondered, are we too late? Are the boys in the escort carriers dead? Luckily, the tin can destroyers of Taffy 3 fought like demons, and Kurita inexplicably lost his nerve and withdrew. Leyte didn't become a slaughterhouse, but as the battle ended, a shadow fell over us. In the south, off Samar, our escort carriers encountered a new horror. Intelligence showed us photos of the USS St. Lo sinking, not by a bomb. A Zero fighter crashed directly into the flight deck. At first, we thought it was a wounded pilot's accident, but reports flooded in. Australia hit. Sangamon hit. Captured pilots confessed. It was a new tactic. The Special Attack Corps formed by Admiral Takijiro Onishi. Planes loaded with explosives, taking off with no intent to return. 1 man, 1 plane, 1 ship. They called it Kamikaze. Silence in Lexington's mess hall. Air-to-air combat? We weren't afraid. The Hellcat ruled the sky. We could splash 200 of them. But how do you defend against a man who wants to die? Before you shot the engine or the pilot, and the plane fell. But with a Kamikaze, unless you blew it into confetti, the burning wreckage would still smash into you. And an Essex deck, loaded with gas and bombs. "This isn't war anymore," Jimmy whispered, staring at the gray ocean. "It's an asylum. They're using human flesh as guidance systems." We won Leyte. We sank Musashi, sank Zuikaku. But just as victory seemed close, hell opened a new door. We were no longer fighting rational soldiers, but brainwashed zealots. The road to Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Japan was now paved with these death traps. I looked at Lexington's broad deck, the source of our power, but in the sunset it looked terrifyingly like a giant bullseye. By early 1945, the flavor of the war had changed completely. If 1944 was a duel of knights on the open ocean, 1945 was a knife fight in a mud pit. We didn't need to find the Japanese fleet. They didn't have one. Our job became supporting the landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. That meant our carriers had to park in fixed boxes, becoming sitting ducks. Our Hellcats still roared, joined now by the bent-wing corsairs. But against the madness called kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, technical superiority wasn't absolute. The Japanese stopped trying to come home. They made themselves the weapon. Every morning, walking to the planes, the crew didn't joke anymore. There was fear in their eyes. Every blip on the radar could be a reaper trying to blow us to kingdom come. If you want to know how tough an Essex-Class really is, you have to hear about the USS Franklin CV-13. March 19, 1945. Task Force 58 was striking Kyushu. Franklin was less than 50 miles from Japan. A lone Judy bomber used the cloud cover to slip through. It dropped two 550-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs. It was a nightmare hit. The bombs punched through the flight deck just as the hangar was packed with 31 fueled and armed planes. The result was apocalyptic. I heard the boom from Lexington. Miles away, I saw the mushroom cloud. Franklin became an erupting volcano. Avgas fires swallowed everything. Bombs in the hangar began to cook off. "She's gone," my XO said, face pale. "No one survives that hell." If it were a Japanese carrier like Taiho, she would have sunk. If it were a pre-war Yorktown, she'd be done. But Franklin was an Essex, though over 800 men died, one of the worst losses in U.S. Navy history. The ship refused to sink. Her damage control systems worked a miracle. Survivors in gas masks fought the fire, and the devil himself, in that furnace. The cruiser Santa Fe came alongside to take off the wounded. In the end, that charred skeleton of a ship, listing heavily, limped halfway around the world under her own power to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. In that moment, we understood. The Essex-Class wasn't just the deadliest carrier. It was the toughest survivor man ever built. While kamikazes plagued us, the Imperial Navy had one card left. Their totem, the Yamato. April 7th, 1945. Operation 10 Go. The largest battleship in history, with fuel for a one-way trip, led a suicide charge to Okinawa to beach herself and fight as a fortress. Tragic romance. But in modern war, romance is death. Mitcher gave Yamato no chance. It was the final conversation between the battleship age and the carrier age, and it was a public execution. I flew in that strike. Arriving southwest of Kyushu, the giant appeared under the clouds. Even from thousands of feet, her size was terrifying. The 460mm guns pointed skyward, the last roar of an old era. Target the big one in the center. That's the prize. It wasn't a battle. It was dismantling. Helldivers from Hornet and Bennington rained bombs on her superstructure. Avengers executed a textbook hammer and anvil attack. Torpedoes from both sides, making evasion impossible. I watched the torpedoes drag white tails into her hull. 1, 2, maybe 10. Yamato struggled. She spat flak wildly, but under the swarm of hundreds of planes, she looked clumsy, helpless. At 14:23, the beast gave out. She capsized to port, her magazine detonating in a cataclysmic blast. The mushroom cloud rose 20,000 feet, higher than we were flying. Watching Yamato vanish, I felt conflicted. As a pilot, I was proud. We ended the centuries of battleship dominance. But as a sailor, watching such an engineering marvel sink felt strangely sorrowful. From then on, the ocean belonged to one master, the aircraft carrier. If sinking Yamato was glory, May 11th on the USS Bunker Hill CV-17 was pure horror. She was Mitcher's flagship. That morning, two kamikazes, a Zero and a Judy, broke through and slammed into Bunker Hill's deck within 30 seconds. The first dropped a bomb and crashed into the parked planes. Seconds later, the second hit, almost the same spot. It wasn't just a fire, it was a massacre. Nearly 400 died. Many were pilots I knew, sitting in the ready room, instantly incinerated. Mitcher survived, but had to transfer to the Enterprise. Days later, Enterprise was hit by a kamikaze. The old man ended up on the Randolph. That bloody spring, every carrier in the task force was scarred. But remember this, not a single Essex-Class carrier was sunk. No matter how many times they crashed into us, These steel hives stood tall. Our damage control was the best in the world, and the ship's design, redundant systems, fire bays, saved thousands. We took the hits, and we kept tightening the noose around Japan's neck. August 15th, 1945. When the radio crackled, "Japan surrenders," I was in Lexington's mess drinking damn instant coffee, no cheering, no throwing hats. We just sat there. Some cried, some stared at the wall. It was over. It was really over. The combined fleet, the rival that made us tremble in 42, was gone. September 2nd, we flew over Tokyo Bay. From the air, the Missouri looked like a toy surrounded by the Allied Armada. Further out lay our home, the carriers of Task Force 38. Mitcher organized a final mass flyover, 1,200 planes blotting out the sun over the Missouri. A salute to peace and a show of power. Flying my Hellcat, I looked down at the Japanese homeland. It was ruins. I thought of the brothers who didn't see this day, the seniors lost at Midway, the friends who ditched in the dark, the pals burned on Bunker Hill. It was us. It was the Essex-Class. It was this fleet that carried the fire halfway across the world, back to the doorstep of those who started it. That is my story. After the war, I retired. But my ship, Lexington, CV-16, and her sisters, Essex, Yorktown, Hornet, their story wasn't over. They were too good to scrap. For decades, they were modified. Angled decks, steam catapults, designed for props. They launched jets, Panthers, Skyhawks, even Phantoms. They fought in Korea. They fought in Vietnam. Some served until the 90s as training ships. The Essex-Class, a war machine built in panic for the crisis of the 40s, ended up defining naval power for half a century. They proved quantity has a quality of its own. They proved survivability is combat power. They proved the assembly line beats Bushido. When I close my eyes, I still hear the call, "Pilots, man your planes." And I still see that deep blue Pacific and that wall of steel standing eternal on the horizon.